If you're a gamer, you still have choice when it comes to which platform and which processor to get. Do you go for Intel or do you go for AMD? Well, that's what we're going to find out today by pitting the Intel i7-13700K against the Ryzen 7 7800X3D, especially considering they are both quite similar in price. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor. Hello mate, you alright? Yeah, just got all the bits from my banging new gaming PC. Just got to put it together. It's going to be so much better than yours. Oh, right. What did you get then? The latest Intel 12th gen processor, a feature-packed motherboard, and 32GB of DDR4 memory. See? Miles ahead of yours. You realise that board needs DDR5 memory, don't you? Don't tell me you went and bought the wrong stuff. DDR4 is so 2014. I can't believe you was that stupid. What? No, you're joking. What should I get then? For me, I'd be looking at Corsair's newest Vengeance DDR5 kits, or if you're wanting that all-important RGB, then go for the Dominator Platinum RGB. Oh, you are a lifesaver, thanks, but where can I find out more? By clicking the link in the description below, of course. And you call me the stupid one. Now, before I get flamed by the AMD lovers here about how the 7800X3D is going to decimate the i7-13700K, there's a little bit more to it than first meets the eye. As of right now, the Ryzen 7 is the more expensive CPU by around 10%, and that gives us something to talk about, because just like with GPUs, it's all about balance and value for money. If something is 10% more expensive, you'd want it to be at least 10% better in terms of performance. Otherwise, the argument for being good value kind of goes out the window. If we suddenly find that performance is only, say, 3% better, then why would you spend 10% more? There's also other factors in terms of longevity and how long that particular CPU and the platform it's on actually lasts, along with the price of motherboards. Sure, we used to have the argument of AM4 versus Z790 with DDR4 versus DDR5, but at least that's now one element that we don't need to focus on, as both the 7800X3D and the X670 platform, as well as the 13700K and the Z790 platform, both utilise DDR5 and feature-wise are very similar. Along with this, while we all know the power of the X3D based CPUs is a pretty impressive thing, not all games can utilise the extra 3D V-cache, and that's where the i7 may make some gains. So that's why I think this will be an interesting one, and maybe not as clear cut as you first may think. Now, before we get into testing, let's talk over the specs a little, because the i7 and the Ryzen 7 are at least in the same product segment. And as mentioned, with the i7 coming in at $409 and the 7800X3D coming in at $449, they are also priced around about in the same segment too. Now, when looking at the specs, they are both 16-core CPUs, though as we know with the 13th generation, they are made up slightly differently, with a mixture of 8 performance cores and 8 efficiency cores, though the performance cores are hyper-threaded, so we actually end up with 24 threads in total. Speed-wise, it's a bit of a mixed bag on paper, with the Intel's base clock of 3.4 GHz on the performance cores to AMD's 4.2 GHz on all cores, while AMD's max boost speed of 5 GHz is slightly trumped by Intel's 5.4 GHz max turbo frequency. So it's hit and miss for both processors, and maybe not as obvious as it may seem at first glance. So how do they actually stack up? Well, that's what we're going to find out. To test, we tried to match our systems as fairly as possible using the same Inno3D RTX 4090 iQube graphics card and the same G-Skill Trident Z5 Neo 32GB 6000MHz memory. For storage, we used the Seagate Firecuda 531TB drive in both systems, with the only difference being the CPUs and the motherboards, where for Intel we used the Asus ROG Z790 Maximus Extreme, while the AMD system used the Gigabyte X670 Aorus Master. Both of the systems were kept cool using the NZXT Z73 RGB AIO coolers and nestled within the NZXT H7 Flow cases and powered by NZXT C1000 Gold power supplies. So, with that all out the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. So starting things off with Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and straight off the bat the 7800X3D does come out on top of our charts at 1080p, but only by a margin of 4%, while at 1440p that margin shrinks to 3%, with 4K seeing the 7800X3D only coming out 2% faster. Considering the 10% extra cost that the 7800X3D retails at, it's not off to a great start for the Ryzen based CPU. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 sees a slightly bigger uplift of 8% at 1080p, which is still somewhat off the mark, while that lead dwindles again to just 5% at 1440p and just 3% at 4K. Again, the performance isn't even matching the extra cost, let alone surpassing it at this point. CSGO is a CPU intensive game, and even here we only see a 3% margin in favour of the 7800X3D at 1080p, while the i7-13700K actually came in with 8% better performance in the lows. 1440p did however see a much larger gap of around 16% to AMD, and the i7 saw the 1% low figures frankly drop quite dramatically. And then at 4K, the 7800X3D was really able to stretch its legs with 28% faster performance compared to the i7, though again the 13700K did come in with slightly better 1% low figures. Cyberpunk is another CPU intensive game, and at 1080p we see our first big change, now with Intel leading over the 7800X3D, albeit by 3%, though the 1% low figure sat an impressive 26% faster at this resolution. As we move up to 1440p, both CPUs came in with identical performance in the averages, but again Intel manages to win this one with 17% better performance in the lows. While at 4K, AMD retakes the top spot, albeit by 2%, equaling just 2 frames per second, though again they do suffer somewhat in the lows. Death Stranding sees both CPUs performing nigh on identically at both 1080p and 1440p, with Intel securing a margin of error better performance in the lows at 1080p, while AMD managed to claw that back, again by a margin of error number, at 1440p. The biggest difference we see is at 4K, where AMD come in 7% faster in the averages and 6% faster in the all-important lows. Next up is Dirt 5, which is famously geared towards AMD, and at 1080p we see that to be the case with a 6% lead over the i7-13700K, while at 1440p that lead shifts a little to now just under 9%. It's at 4K where both CPUs come in with very similar results, separated by just a single frame per second, and also being beaten by the 7900X and 5800X3D, though only by around 3%. Moving on to Dying Light 2, and we start to see our biggest difference yet, with the Ryzen 7 commanding a strong 20% lead over the Intel CPU at 1080p, though that huge margin halves to just 10% when we bump up to 1440p, which still puts it where you'd want due to the 10% extra cost that the 7800X3D comes in at. 4K sees the AMD CPU still coming out on top when compared to the i7, but only by a much smaller 3%. F122 sees a somewhat strong lead at 1080p of 13%, but 1440p has both CPUs coming in with identical performance, though AMD still comes out on top thanks to the stronger 1% lows. Then, in a turn up for the books, Intel pushes ahead at 4K with a 5% boost over the Ryzen 7800X3D, which isn't good news for the more expensive CPU, especially if you are running one of these with an RTX 4090, because 4K is likely the resolution you'd be gaming at anyway. Far Cry 6 sees Intel coming in 4% faster than AMD at 1080p, and also with a margin of error lead of just 1 FPS at 1440p, though AMD fights back at 4K, coming in 7% faster, though Intel's 1% low figures, although just 1 FPS higher than AMD, are pretty hard to ignore. Booting up Forza Horizon 5, and we have a new winner for the biggest margin of 23% in favour to the 7000 series Ryzen CPU at 1080p, and with a similar 22% lead at 1440p, which actually saw the 7800X3D come in performing better than it did at 1080p, though that was pretty much the same case with all of the processors tested. It's only at 4K where the performance dropped, but AMD still held on to a 17% lead, which is pretty impressive considering the extra cost demanded from Team Red. Hogwarts Legacy is a game that we've added recently by popular request, and here the 7800X3D comes out on top at all 3 resolutions, with a 6% lead at 1080p, 5% at 1440p, and just a 2% lead at 4K, meaning that while the extra performance is nice, it's not enough to warrant the extra outlay needed to buy the chip. Horizon Zero Dawn really does favour AMD, and that's clear to see, as the 7800X3D comes in a whopping 37% faster at 1080p and an equally impressive 32% faster at 1440p. It's only at 4K where things take a bit of a nosedive, with the 7800X3D only coming in with a 3% lead over Intel. Spiderman at 1080p presented a similar argument, with AMD coming in stronger by 23%, while that shrunk slightly to 19% at 1440p, with all CPUs performing within the same range as they did at the lower resolution. It's only at 4K where things change up a bit and we see the gap narrow to just 9%, again still in favour of the Ryzen 7 7800X3D. In Microsoft Flight Sim, it's a game where the 3D V-Cache really does come into its own, punching out 31% more performance at 1080p, 33% at 1440p, and then a still impressive but slightly lower 21% at 4K. This is one of those titles where the 7800X3D really comes into its own, but you could get a similar uplift just by enabling DLSS 3 on any of the CPUs we featured, as long as your GPU has that functionality. The performance in Red Dead Redemption 2 was much closer, with just 4% separating the two processors, though still in favour of AMD. While 1440p saw them switch around and Intel now pushing more performance, again by 4%, though the i7 did suffer quite a bit in the 1% lows by 16%. Then at 4K, Intel managed to stay ahead by 8% and with similar 1% lows, which considering the AMD CPU is the more expensive, there's not much of a selling point for Team Red when it comes to this title. Then finally in Watch Dogs Legion, AMD holds its own, coming in 18% faster at 1080p and a still respectable 16% at 1440p. While 4K again doesn't do the Ryzen based processor any favours, with just a 4% lead over the i7-13700K. Again, considering that extra 10% cost involved, does 4K gaming on the 7800X3D really offer up value for money? So by looking at each individual game, it's clear to see some pretty strong gains in certain titles going to the 7800X3D. But as I mentioned at the start, it's not as clear cut as you may think, as while the AMD CPU did come out on top in most tests, that wasn't always the case, and the Intel kind of CPU did fight back in a few games. And even in the ones it lost, the 1% low figures were sometimes better. Then, even with AMD coming out as the victor, some only saw around 4% or so in favour of Team Red, which doesn't really justify the 10% extra cost that's needed to buy it over the i7. To get a better all-round picture of what's going on across all 16 games, it's worth looking at the 16 game overall average to kind of really see how much better things are, as no one's going to buy a new CPU to play just a single game for the life of that system. It's here at 1080p where the 7800X3D does come out on top, but only by a mere 6%, which when factoring in the 10% extra cash needed to go with AMD, is a bit of a bad situation. At 1440p, that gap does widen slightly now to 8%, but again just falls below the mark of where you'd want that performance to be. For me, matching at 10% is one thing, but I think any AMD hardcore fans would want it to smash through it and surpass it to really give you that bang for buck that AMD have traditionally been kind of all about. Even at 4K, which as I said earlier is where you'd likely be playing with an RTX 4090 on one of these chips, we only see the same 6% margin that we saw at 1080p. And that leaves, I don't know, a hollow victory, if you can even call it a victory. So where does that actually leave us? Well, in all honesty, I think it's clear to see that the AMD Ryzen 7800X3D is by far the superior CPU in terms of gaming performance. And that really comes down to if you have the ability to throw more money at a platform. Though I think it's safe to say that AMD have a better track record when it comes to longevity, and their own words about AM5 giving us a bit more of an upgrade path if you go down the kind of AMD route, while I guess the Intel setup will be a bit more restricted with just a 14th generation refresh coming later this year, but really nowhere else to go beyond that. It's also worth noting that while the Intel does offer better value for money across all three resolutions, it's only by around 3% when looking at the cost per frame. So really, again, the Ryzen seems to be the better given choice. Yes, you could argue that the 5800X3D that we included offers far superior value overall, but you'll be on a platform that is essentially now dead. Though if you're already on AM4, it's the much more kind of better proposition when looking at a cost to change. But with nowhere to go after, you'll likely be upgrading to a 7000 series or an Intel equivalent in the future anyway. So really it's down to the choice of one big upgrade now, or essentially doing two smaller upgrades that are slightly staggered, which I guess would actually cost you more overall. Now, the other thing I want to touch on is that while we use the same memory for testing both the 7800X3D and the 13700K, the AMD could garner similar results and use cheaper memory at the same time, which could actually save you that extra $40 that you'd be expected to pay for the CPU in the first place. And with motherboards on both platforms having pretty much the same price point, the overall cost of the system could actually work out identically. So there we have it. The i7-13700K is a great CPU, don't get me wrong, but due to other factors including the longevity and overall performance that we saw in a few titles, like Microsoft Flight Sim, where 3D V-Cache really makes a pretty stark difference, I'm finding it hard not to recommend AMD for this one. And that about wraps it up. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you want to help support everything that we do here, then you can help by joining the exclusive Patreon club, where you'll get access to monthly live streams, access to a super special area on our Discord, bi-weekly game nights, which are absolutely hilarious, behind the scenes content, and honestly, so much more. The link for all that amazing stuff is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys.